Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Robert Iaria, and he is the Vice President of Client Solutions and Logistics at B-Stock Solutions. And we're going to be talking about B-Stock Solutions, their focus on returns, excess inventory, unsold inventory, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when that type of inventory comes up, how to handle it, and some different channels to be able to get rid of that inventory or do something with it besides having it go to waste, really. So we're going to dive into that topic. So, Rob, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here today.
Absolutely. Happy to get you on. Happy to talk about this topic. I think it's very important to cover, and I think it's something that is a big problem that we see increasingly throughout the industry, and certainly need some solutions to be able to address that. So before we kind of dive into some details around that, why don't you give us kind of an overview of B Stock Solutions and what it is that you all do?
Sure. Yeah, B-Stock, we've been around for about 15 years now. And I'd really consider us a pioneer in terms of creating a platform approach to sourcing inventory in the re-commerce industry, right? In the past, you had traditional liquidators that may come and back up a truck and pay pennies on the dollar for inventory. And what B-Stock was a pioneer in is developing a platform and bringing a wide variety of buyers and interested entrepreneurs that come and pay market pricing for this inventory.
Mm,
B stock, since inception, we sell inventory in all categories. We help sellers of all sizes and different categories. We have 9 of the top 10 retailers that utilize our platform
mm,
to liquidate excess inventory and returns merchandise. And so in that time, like you mentioned, it's sneaky a big challenge, right? There's a
mm,
lot of this inventory that gets returned or excess inventory that goes unsold. And in our 15 years, we've helped sell over $200 billion
wow.
worth of inventory, right? Retail value inventory. How we do that, we bring in a worldwide network of what we call re-commerce entrepreneurs. So it's a lot of small businesses to mid-sized businesses. Some of them may be import or exporting inventory into other countries, running small outlet stores, flea markets, online re-commerce, eBay sellers, things like that. So there is just a wide variety of these entrepreneurs out there that are able to find a second home for that inventory versus, like you said,
Mm,
having it go to waste and into landfill.
yeah.
And so, what B Stock specializes is in providing that platform. But then, my team specifically on the client solution side, and what we'll get into a little bit today, what we really focus on is helping those sellers
Mm,
create strategies to make their inventory as valuable as possible. So our goal is to try to increase the amount of what we call cost recovery on
mm,
that inventory. And we work with them. We work with them to understand the constraints within their supply chain, and then design kind of a resale strategy that maximize the recovery within those constraints.
mm.
And so that's what we have a team here doing and looking at all day, every day, really.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, and obviously, I mean, $200 billion in inventory is certainly a big number, right? So obviously, this is a big issue that's out there, and there's a big market for this if you're able to be able to sell that amount or resell that amount and get that recovery. But tell us a little bit about before we kind of dive into some of the ways that you're doing this and how the right solutions come into play. I mean, talk to us a little bit about the issue itself. I mean, why is unsold excess inventory, returned inventory? I mean, why is it such a big issue? I mean, that you can create a whole company around just trying to solve the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, when you think about the size of it, so according to the National Retail Federation, just in the last year, U.S. retailers had unsold inventory
Hmm.
equaling $224 billion. So,
Wow.
right, you constantly have merchants and retailers looking to bring new items, try new things, and not all of them hit. Right, demand planning is very challenging, and even more so, right, through COVID and the pandemic and some of the
Hmm.
whiplash effect that was happening there. And so, just from an excess inventory standpoint, um, they're not going to get it right all the time.
Mm.
Okay, and the next thing related to that is how quickly can you make a decision then on that inventory that is obsolete or is aging. um, the slow moving inventory is going to take up rack space,
Right.
and that's just something that's blocking more productive inventory from coming through.
Mm.
um, and the value of those goods then in the secondary market is going to degrade over time. If you think about a lot of the electronics and technology, right, there's always a new phone or a new gadget that's coming out that's better than the last. And so if you're not
Mm.
making decisions quickly on that, you're really sacrificing some of the cost recovery. And so
Yeah.
that, that in general, just the broad sheer size of that um, is a big problem, and one that I think is challenging for retailers or inventory owners. It's really hard to say, "Hey, let's pull the plug on this
Yeah.
and let's liquidate this at a loss." And so, I think that's a big piece is how do you develop systems and programs where this becomes systematic and you can plan for it, knowing that you're not going to be 100% right on your products or your merchandising decisions, 100% of the time.
Mm.
And so that's like the overstock side of it. I think just as big though is the return side,
Yeah.
right? And so with e-com now becoming a growing channel, you see return rates even higher than brick and mortar rates.
Mm.
And so return rates have also increased. So a couple more stats for you there. I think $743 billion of merchandise in 2023
Wow.
is what the estimated returns volume was for the retail industry. And that's 14.5% of sales.
Mm.
Um, Even this time of year, what we're busy helping everyone with is that big influx of holiday returns,
Right.
right? Just the holiday season alone, $145 billion is estimated to be returned. And so, getting back to the concept of the warehousing side of things, if you think about, um, what those retailers and what those supply chains need to be prepared for is this big influx of return volume coming in, and what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
How can you get it to flow through your building and optimize the performance of that stuff, knowing that it's a big peak that you have to be prepared for.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's such a an interesting thing. I mean, because it is so so large, the number too, and we'll touch on the returns, but I'm curious about you mentioned there, having to make the decision as the retailer or the inventory owner to pull the plug on something. I think is a very challenging thing to do. I know in my experience, my career, working warehouses, especially, as an inventory control manager, trying to convince certain people that hey, we need to to let go of some of these things that I've just been sitting in the warehouse for, a year, 2 years. In some cases, I saw stuff that's sitting for, 5 years there, and they just don't want to let go of it because they think that maybe there's a chance to sell it, right? But I mean, what advice or maybe how do you kind of work with your customers, your clients to make them realize that, hey, like, even if you were to sell one unit of that this year, it's not worth it to hold it because you're missing out on potential opportunity. Or I mean, how do you get people to kind of open their eyes, I guess, and cross that line to say like, okay, like yeah, it's time to pull the plug on this inventory.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess for starters, I would say across all of our client base, there is not a single playbook for how people make these decisions. In fact,
Mm,
I found on the overstock side of things, it is one of the more muddy processes that I've
yeah.
witnessed with clients is figuring out who ultimately, provides that green light to move ahead with a solution.
Mm,
Um, Now, again, I guess if I were to give best practices, one, it's lean into, a provider like us. We are able to provide a bunch of data on how different categories, different conditions, different types of products perform in the secondary market. And so the clients that have been most successful with making these decisions on when to pull inventory off the floor or out of those fulfillment bins, they're constantly leveraging our historical data, the information around pricing in the secondary market, and
mm,
feeding that back. And if you're doing that upstream and on a regular cadence, it's easier to plan, I think, collaboratively with the merchandising teams. Whereas if you're waiting and waiting, and now all of a sudden you're trying to make a decision on a very large, bulky amount of inventory, that gets even more challenging. And so I think what I would say is build in like a regular cadence. Once a month, we're going to do this. We're committing to moving out of X number of SKUs or,
yeah.
whatever it might be. If it falls below a certain threshold, but do it on a more regular basis than waiting for the end of the year. And now all of a sudden, I'm trying to get everything off of the books in the last 30 days of the year.
Mm,
Um, I think sellers and inventory owners would be shooting themselves in the foot to take that approach, because now you're competing at the end of the year with everyone else who maybe hasn't planned as effectively as well. And, the secondary market, liquidation market, is much like any other market. It's supply and demand and
mm.
availability, and that can really impact pricing. And so, yeah, that would be the kind of the two things I would say is leverage, the data pricing to be upstream in your decision making, and develop a regular kind of standard cadence to go about doing this. Don't deal with it, once a year and in more of that episodic nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really good advice too. And I think it's interesting to see because in my experience, I know a lot of the times when the topic came up, it was not because there was a regular cadence to review, as much as I would try and bring it up on my side. But really, when it came to a head was when, hey, like our space utilization in the warehouse is like, we're running out of space right in the warehouse, and it's like, well, you could probably free up 200 pallet spaces just by getting stuff that hasn't sold in the last year, right? And that's kind of like the challenge. But like you said, then it becomes kind of well, how can we get rid of this, and where can we get some money for it or something like that? So I mean, tell us a little bit about kind of maybe the different channels there on what are the options when you have some of this unsold excess inventory or maybe returns that aren't going to go back to the shelf. I mean, what are some options you have there in terms of channels to recoup something from it?
Yeah. So when you think about the different options that these inventory owners have,
Mm,
the first, if it's a return, can you put it back in stock? Or if it's overstock, do you leave it in stock and develop a markdown cadence? So let's assume that those are off the table and we're just looking at obsolete inventory now. That's where B stock really is playing. Your other option could be landfill and or recycling, or maybe donation. Donation's actually a great one that I think all
mm,
sellers should include in a multi-channel strategy. Where can things make a bunch of sense? We work with a pet supply retailer, and was just talking with them a couple of weeks ago, and they were sharing how they're very intentional about donating to shelters, and
Mm,
the shelters in return come and do adoption events at some of their locations. And that creates foot traffic. And so, great example and use of donation.
mm,
Now, based on the size, scale, and the volume that we've been talking about, obviously that won't solve the problem. And
yeah.
so, when it comes to increasing and improving cost recovery for your inventory, that's where the secondary market comes into play. And so I talked a little bit about how liquidation was performed in the past with traditional liquidators. And traditional liquidators may come in, take a look at the inventory, and offer kind of a set amount. Normally, they're negotiating with the seller to try to determine price.
Mm,
On the alternative, and what B Stock I think did in disrupting this industry a little bit, is developed a solution that's more platform based, and we have an auction solution. And so what we do is much like an eBay type solution, right? We're offering auctions and bringing in a wide variety of demanded businesses that I kind of highlighted earlier.
mm,
And they're able to go and browse and determine what type of inventory makes the most sense for them.
mm,
They'll bid on it, and then we execute orders and fulfill from there. Now, not everyone, I talked earlier about my team and what we do to understand the constraints of our different sellers' supply chains.
right.
Not every supply chain is set up to auction off a pallet at a time or a truckload at a time.
Hmm.
And so, an alternate solution that we have is where we auction um, the ability to fulfill a length of order, a number of orders over a length of time. So,
Mm,
what that might look like is you are bidding for the opportunity to receive 3 truckloads of inventory a week out of a
mm,
certain seller location. And we'll
interesting.
focus on different categories or different conditions. That's all part of what we work with our client on, is to understand how can the client prepare the inventory in a way that will get them the best recovery possible. And
Mm,
so that's kind of the art of what we start to get into then, is using data, using information to recommend how they might break inventory up, how they might prepare it for shipping and make it available.
mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's great the creative ways you've kind of come up with to do that. And I love the idea that you can bid on, like you said, maybe it's a large retailer that has a large amount of inventory they're trying to move, and then you want to take it, but like you said, you don't have the resources or the space to take everything at once, and like you said, you get 3 truckloads a week or something like that. I mean, I think that's a great flexible use case there, and a way to make some creative decisions around doing things like that. So very interesting, and obviously, I think we see a lot of challenge around. I think one of those channels, which I think we try to avoid as much as possible, right, end up being the landfill. So, I mean, how important is it for B stock, to make sure that all of this kind of material is, finding a home in some way, in some avenue, and staying away from, ending up in the landfill. I mean, I think that's one thing that certainly is a topic of discussion, is, especially with the increase in returns, how do we prevent this stuff from getting to that point? And I'm curious, like, where is that in terms of like priority for B stock and the clients that you're working with?
I mean, I think what we're seeing more and more now is these retailers are investing in reverse logistics, and they
Mhm.
see, both from their ERG sustainability goals, but again, from their bottom line impact, that investing in roles that say reverse logistics, that are focused, that are able to kind of cross the different functional areas within their organizations, they are seeing that investing in that is making a ton of sense, right? And so,
mm,
we talked earlier about those merchandising decisions, but the reverse logistics experts that we partner with at all of our clients, they're reaching across merchandising, warehousing, transportation, finance, and pulling together these solutions that are intended to get things out of landfill and to get the highest pricing and recovery possible. And so
mm,
I think what's been great for us is to, find those like-minded individuals now that our clients are investing in, and jointly work with them on strategies and the things that I've seen. So I've been at BStock 4 or 5 years now.
mm,
I worked at a 3PL where we were doing the logistics for BStock longer than that. So I've been in reverse logistics for quite a long time now.
mm.
And it amazes me that you can find a home for almost anything, right? I can't
Yeah.
tell you how much PPE, face masks, hand sanitizer, things like that we helped people get rid of
Mm,
through COVID. And, um, it part of it is just really understanding good expectations around the pricing and the costing of things. And so, um, for those PPE items, it was really more around helping them avoid the cost to dispose of it. And as
mm.
long as they could get it out,
Yeah.
um, and have it shipped, they were pretty happy in that scenario.
Mm,
Um, and so, yeah, it is one of the cool things that I see is the unique things that the resale entrepreneurs are able to do with inventory that they take in, and the different business models they have to get stuff back out to the consumer, in areas where, right, discounted pricing is important to their
yeah.
communities. Um, and so, yeah, that's been a really cool part of, you know, being within this ecosystem of B stock.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's such a great thing to hear, and I love the fact too that you're pointing out that you could find a home for almost anything, which I think is really important, and having people that can help you facilitate that, like B stock. I mean, makes such a great difference. I think in how that product initially ends up in the long term, and I think that's a really a good thing to focus on there and highlight as well. So, I mean, as we look at the case for returns, and as you mentioned, lots of companies are investing in reverse logistics, and obviously with the continued growth of e-commerce, returns continues to grow too, as we see. So we want to talk a little bit about kind of how the velocity of a skew kind of comes into that return strategy, right? Because sometimes, we get things returned, and maybe it's past the season for that, like if it's a bathing suit or maybe some flip-flops or something like that. But sometimes we get stuff that, hey, like we would want to get this back on the shelf as soon as possible. So I mean, how do you create a strategy and think about the velocity of those skews within that reverse logistics strategy and returns overall process?
Yeah. So, what I would say is, for starters, that strategy has to be in place upstream. You
Mm,
can't wait until the inventory comes back and then say, hey, let me look into what I should be doing with this. And so, what we're doing is we're constantly working upstream with our clients to determine, again, what we'll call like a sorting strategy when it comes back to a return center.
mm,
What is the best thing that should be done with these items? And so, the retailers definitely know out of their point of sale systems what's hot, what's selling, what's in demand, and what their inventory levels look like. And so the easiest stuff is probably the things that we know go back to shelf, get back put into stock, because they're
mm,
going to do well. Uh, it's what happens to the things that don't want to go back to stock. And I think, the things that we encourage folks to do well and to invest in is centered really on data and information around the inventory. So you want to gather good data about both obsolete and returned inventory to be able to share with that secondary market, because
mm,
the general rule of thumb is all of these resale entrepreneurs, the more information that they have about inventory, the more confident they will be in purchasing it and paying a
Right.
healthy price for it.
Mm,
So that's step one. The second one, I think, is developing processes that give you the flexibility to offer inventory in different and unique ways. Maybe in like maybe a better way to say is like a curated approach. And so, the ultimate velocity would be getting a bunch of returns in and stuffing them all in a trailer and selling it as a mixed trailer of every category that might be on the shelf of a retailer.
mm,
What we typically are exploring with those sellers is, can you curate this in a way that's attractive to different segments of this recommerce community? So maybe folks that just focus in apparel or footwear, furniture specifically. So category specific curation
mhm,
of inventory is kind of a best practice, but you really need to invest in ways to be able to take that inventory in, sort it accordingly, and then be able to fulfill it. Right. And so that's something, again, we're constantly talking about, and we understand some people have that capability. They have the systems, they have the labor, they have the space to do it.
mm,
Others don't. And when they don't, it's about how can you, at least you get information about all of the items that are on that trailer on a given pallet so that we can merchandise it, advertise it, and promote it effectively for them.
mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's such an important thing, like you mentioned there, to focus on the upstream, right, and making sure that that strategy is in place, and not having it kind of just waiting for those returns to come back and then make decisions about it because you're missing out on time. So I mean, having that kind of upstream and understanding, like, okay, like this is, this is what we want to quickly turn back onto the shelf because we know that it's going to go out the door again as it's a hot item, right, or something that's popular seller for us versus something that's like, okay, we're going to end up selling this off, or getting to a reseller or other channel, facilitated by you guys in some sense. I mean, I think it's so important to understand that the almost the decision needs to be made right before the occasion even arrives, basically, right before the return is even back and in your facility. You want to make sure that you have that decision already made, and exactly where that's going to go, so you can be as nimble and flexible and fast as
Yeah, that's great.
possible to. Yeah.
The decision's definitely upstream. You're constantly looking at it. And, one thing I guess I'd add to that is having a very disciplined understanding of the cost to touch inventory when it does come back. Right. And so some of the things I'm talking about around like category specific sorts,
Hmm.
there's cost to touching that
Yeah.
potentially multiple times. And we talk a lot around, hey, what's the incremental lift in price you can get by doing so? And is it worth the extra touches and the extra cost that you put into preparing it for resale?
Mm,
And sometimes the answer is it doesn't make sense, right? We typically, general rule of thumb is if a retail price is below a certain threshold, say $20, it may not be worth it to touch that inventory multiple times. You may want to have a very quick throughput. You may not even want to spend time, manifesting it. You sell it off as mixed,
mm,
manifested type inventory. And so, that's something we talk about with all of our clients is understanding the cost to be able to, fulfill this inventory in different ways.
mm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's an important thing to highlight there because the more you touch it, the more it ends up costing, and the more your margins start to shrink. And it does make sense, and sometimes I think it's hard to see because I think the human mind naturally wants to think that, oh, if I can recover something, right, then I can sell it again and I can make money. And then if you look at really the total cost of making that happen, sometimes it's like, well, I'm actually not making money, right? Or I'm barely making money, or I'm losing money in some cases, right? So, I mean, it's great to be able to highlight that and focus on those things. So, I'm curious before we wrap up here. I mean, if you were to give like one piece of advice for an operation that's looking at either whether it's excess unsold inventory or a flood of returns. I mean, what would be the one piece of advice you would give them to kind of maybe get a hold of that or get a better strategy around that?
Yeah, it's some of the same things we've been talking about. I think it starts with giving someone the autonomy and the authority to design your reverse logistics solution. So if they haven't yet truly invested in making good decisions around reverse logistics and around the secondary market, invest in that person that can go and understand all of the moving parts. It can understand both the cost to serve
Mm,
as well as what the market might bear for pricing for your inventory, because it does have value. So I think
mm,
that's where it starts. Once you have that person, it's investing in the data around, do we have good information about this inventory to make that re-commerce community more confident in their purchasing decisions for our inventory. And then lastly, from an operational perspective, are you designing your processes in a way that allow you velocity and decision making or dispositioning of
mm,
inventory? Um, are you designing them in a way where you're able to get price determination pretty quickly for your inventory? And then lastly, the velocity of which you can fulfill inventory. Right. So we
mm,
talked about getting returns out of the building. The other thing, when you get back to excess inventory, um, we talked about, are you on a monthly cadence and are you fulfilling this regularly, or is it sort of a one-time pull at the very end of the year? What we've seen is we can work to get price determination for inventory, and then it's the end of the year and this fulfillment center is busy doing their forward fulfillment of
yeah.
holiday peak, and they have a really hard time prioritizing or getting that inventory out effectively.
Mm,
Um, so
interesting.
again, I think to summarize it, it's getting someone with that authority to put these processes together, and then be really focused on the velocity in which you're able to do it. Because every day that it goes by, that obsolete inventory, that's money you could be putting into more productive activities or more productive inventory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are great points there as well. And, trying to prioritize that, I think, not only from your perspective, but from the decision maker's perspective, as you highlighted, who's going to make that decision, like cut bait basically on this inventory and get that moving is such an important thing to understand and to be able to put the forefront to be able to understand that before it becomes a larger problem than it needs to be, and it creates other operational challenges for you. So really great insights from you here, Rob, and really appreciate the information around these types of issues and how B Stock is helping to solve them. If people are interested in learning more about B Stock solutions, what's the best way to do that?
Probably simply head to the URL at bstock.com. And if either you're a buyer interested in buying inventory on the platform or a seller, we have different links for sellers, for buyers, and you can go explore the path from there. That's how you can find us.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well. So, Rob, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. And thank you for diving into this topic with me.
Thanks again for having us. Take care.